What if I told you that the common philosophy that we've used for determining the appropriate use of force and for describing something that we might call the imperative for one's capability of violence has been wholly insufficient, and that in our modern times we are being made more and more aware of this as every day passes? What if I told you that the way that we think about how we approach being prepared or being capable of violence was primarily taken from situations that don't necessarily apply to most, if not any of us? Let's use this as an example. But before we get into it too far, thank you. If you're watching on YouTube, you get to see the new set piece. We are building this out as we go. So there will be some changes as we keep going through the next couple days. But as you are listening, expect it to remain mostly the same. We're going to be going deeper into the philosophy of violence. That is this show, the Redacted Culture Cast. We are on episode 91 as well, so thank you very much for your support. If you want to join into the discussion and get some of the behind the scenes, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. We are using locals because Patreon has a bad reputation of deleting stuff. Moving on. So, for decades, the common justification given for becoming capable of violence sounds something like this: you should train so that you are able to meet a force, you are able to defend yourself in the event that something attempts to invade on your rights. That's the slightly more thorough way of describing it, but you should train so that you are able to meet and defend yourself against threats to your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness or property. You should train because the police are a 15-minute phone call away when the threat is on your doorstep. You should train because no one is coming to save you. You should train because no one is here that has responsibility for your well-being as much as you do. And these arguments are sufficient if we use them in a conditional sense. And the conditional sense requires an assumption. The assumption is that there is either the presence or potentiality, a potential presence of there being a threat to your life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness, or pursuit of property, if we want to get more historically accurate. And this moral imperative, the morality of this situation implies in its language that the presence or potential presence of a threat is required both required and perhaps a prerequisite for being capable. And this leaves a massive intellectual gap in our way of thinking about why we would train or why we'd be capable of violence or why we would understand these things like situational awareness or the rights of man or this thing that we call living in a permissive or non-permissive environment. In fact, not every day of our lives is built into some sort of mission set where we have good guys and bad guys, and not every day and not every opportunity that we present ourselves with puts ourselves in that ideal or correct scenario that does create the justification necessary as described. In fact, what it does is it opens up a massive avenue of approach for those who have military understanding, avenue of approach, method, or way that you can be attacked from, a massive avenue of approach on the intellectual side of our defense. And that is, if I can take away, in theory, the potentiality of somebody attacking you, then you are in no way, shape, or form justified in being capable or dangerous, or I'm sorry, you are no longer justified in being capable of violence or dangerous. There's a very easy way that this presents itself in the 21st century. If we could just police state everyone into a position of semi-permanent compliance, then there is no reason why you as the citizen, you as an individual, would have any reason or right to train or own a firearm, to own a means of defense and be capable of using it. And this argument comes up quite frequently in surface level conversations about some of the most morally heavy conversations that we can have in this country or in this world. If we, philosophically speaking, if we talk about cause and effect and necessary preconditions for something of this sort, if we rely on simply the potentiality of violence being done to us as a necessary prerequisite for our own capability of defending ourselves or of violence, what we necessarily do is we open ourselves up for the justification of slavery. If the right to bear arms is dependent on the potentiality of the need to defend ourselves, then in theory, an individual or a government could claim that if they were to, by some divine right, in theory, remove that potentiality from happening, then so goes your right to bear arms. If we can, in theory, dissolve the potentiality of violence, there evaporates before your very eyes the right to bear arms. Now, on the front end of this, we might say, well, that's absurd. You couldn't possibly do that. There's no way that you could take people and make them incapable of things like violence without removing some part of them that is a human. And this is perhaps the right way to start looking at it. This is a window into the direction we're going. We can expand on this more thoroughly through ideas like escalation of force and de-escalation of force, and we're going to be able to expand into this as well with how the appropriateness of force, this theory, this idea of the appropriateness of force, comes out. But how about what were to happen if I were to make an argument for an individual? What happens if I were to make an argument that includes a moral imperative that says you must go out and train so that you will not do evil? That turns the whole idea on its head. That completely flips the script for the world that we live in. In fact, it changes the way that we as society think of being a good citizen. A good citizen in this example, or a good individual, is not somebody who is incapable of violence or perceived as incapable of violence, but rather, as even Jordan Peterson has said many times, or as a couple of other long established philosophers who have been around for and alive and dead for years, make the argument that a harmless man is not a good man. But we're going to get into that in a little bit. And I want to make the argument that perceiving oneself as harmless is the gateway to democide. So let's use this as an example. Well, no, let's not use it. Let's use this as an example. You have two individuals, right? And this is a very common example that may be presented. But you have a boxer, and if the term is a relic of the 1990s, a couch potato. You have your individual who has learned how to fight, and you have an individual who has not. Now, that person who has learned how to fight, at least with his hands, understands that to some extent he's capable of hurting other people. And he knows that he, through his practice, as he's learned what it feels, perhaps, or at least should have learned what it feels like to both hit and be hit, both to use his fists within the boxing arena and to have others' fists used against him. Don't take them the wrong way. You can all, I know the internet will always turn everything into a sexual joke, but let's move on. So, in this example, this classic example, you've got two individuals, one who understands what he's capable of and one who doesn't. Now, if both of those individuals were placed in a situation where, in our classic defense scenario, were required to defend themselves, we know that, or we would like to assume that that individual who at least has some modicum of understanding of what he's capable of through practice, through sparring, is going to be able to react better. He's going to be able to perceive the situation more clearly because he understands more of the dynamics that are involved in fighting with one's hands. But also, he might, we believe, he will have some understanding of scaling. For example, if he is presented by somebody with a handgun, he's probably not going to just try to punch him. Scenarios change, don't overthink it. Whereas the individual who has no training at all is going to be faced with the reality that he's been threatened by violence, and then following that up with the reality that he is incapable of doing anything about it. And outside of video games and underdog stories, typically things don't go well for this second individual. Outside of that fictional world where people rise to the occasion and quickly but effectively defeat the opponent through their innate heroism. Well, that's not the real world. That's why it's a story. But we do learn things from stories about like being courageous. Maybe it is just courage that the individual needs. But now what happens if we were to take this in a different way? Something much, much more important. And that's the way that I think that we can come to a set of a sort of, at least the beginning of an imperative for why you should train that does not leave one panic stricken looking for whatever the most likely threat is against him and his well-being and so on and so forth. And there's a reason for this too. There's an extended reason for this one. One is if we look at the way that gun culture has approached its justification for individuals' capability, we unsurprisingly see that so much of the arguments and so much of the drama and so much of the little petty debates that go back and forth between peoples on the internet is sort of a weird, ego-driven challenge to see which person is wiser because they have a better, more articulate description of what the looming threat is going to be. You have one guy who says, "Oh, it's going to be an EMP from the sky," and then the next person says, "Well, no, an EMP is not very likely. Rather, we have a problem with the water grid here." And then a third person says, "Wait, why can't both happen at the same time? Foreign countries involved in attacking those." And the third person comes in and says, "You're all interested on the economy and all this big stuff out here, but none of you have paid any time to look into where you grow your food or where you build your solar farm or whatever." And this turns our sort of post-survivalist, pre-apocalypse, whatever you want to call it, this sort of survivalist argument into which person has the better way of seeing whatever the potential threat is. Oh, you think it's going to be government tyranny? Well, you're wrong because the cops will never do this. And this is this sort of fruitless argument. I mean, there is something good to be found in it. Don't get me wrong. But this ultimately frustrating argument that goes all the way through gun culture so often about almost a competition for who can best describe the potential apocalypse that's upon us. And while that might while that might provide some good, as in people who are capable of being humble enough to understand that other people have opinions and you might learn from them, but you are ultimately responsible for your own actions, then we can learn from it and have respectful conversation and respectful dialogue. What we end up doing is we end up skipping over the imperative of why we should even do this at all. If the world is really going to come crashing down, are we not deserved of that terrible future? Oh, what a terrible fate has befallen you. That is not the right way of saying the opening to Majora's Mask, but don't get too distracted as I say this to myself. I'm getting over a bit of a not feeling well, so I have to drink more and more fluids. Otherwise, this raspy smoker's voice is going to turn into probably just squeaks and horribleness. Moving on. So, if the basis for training and being prepared, if the moral justification, if our intellectual justification for doing these things is purely on the potentiality of an apocalypse or a bad outcome or a threat or a riot or whatever, that might help to, in a sense, inform us of good strategies or good ideas, things to put in place to give us a better chance of weathering said hardship, but it does not give us a justification of why. We're kind of back to an is ought divide here. If we've listened to this show for a while, you'll know that I'm fond of addressing the is ought divide, is being a sort of a field of science and ought being a field of morality, which implies in this philosophy, this theology, a moral or a religious element. I don't. We'll eventually have to do an episode on spirituality versus religion, because that's going to be probably one that makes some people unhappy. But we'll get into it. So if we're going to go into it here, let's address this idea. We have a bit of the is. If we know that this is going to happen, these physical things are going to happen, whether they are man-made disasters, or there's a high likelihood of man-made disasters, or there's a high likelihood of natural disasters, then we know that we can use certain things and skill sets to better survive, thrive through, or overcome said challenges. But that does not answer the question why. If I tell you that if you train in this way every day, you will be able to pass the physical side of ranger school much easier, that does not give you the why of doing it. It doesn't give you the moral imperative for why you should even try to consider something like ranger school to begin with. And this is a great problem that we deal with in the 21st century. It's almost like the materialism problem continues to rear its head over and over and over again. We have the means of self-defense. We have the firearms and the plate carriers and the night vision, and we have all of this material at our fingertips. But do we really know why we're doing it? And while I don't think I'm going to be able to answer this in any single episode of this show, there is something that I'm getting to in this episode that is one piece of why you should train. Not how you should train, not what kind of threats are on your doorstep, but why you should train. Why you should become capable as an individual at violence. Why you should, in the language of so many people, become dangerous. And that goes something like this. If you go to Twitter, which is not exactly the place that I would go for moral decisions, but if you go to Twitter, you will find no shortage of people advocating for great levels of violence. And there's a special type of violence that that at least social media has sort of accepted as permissible, so to speak. And it exists in this weird level where it has to be big enough and far enough away from the individual so as to be considered justifiable. And it usually says something like this: wouldn't it be great if the government got rid of all those pesky blank? Or this country has too many people like this blank? Or our government needs to crack down on blank. And while there are certain ways that this can be said to be understandable, like the government should crack down on crime, or the government should crack down on the southern border, the drugs being traveled to the southern border, or whether the government should this or the government should that. What you find is you often find a correlation between an individual who is willing to make claims for something like democide and what their physiognomy is. Physiognomy is a bit of a Greek term that argues something like this. And for those who are much more familiar with the term, please don't completely crucify me. But if you put the comments down below, I'll get back to you. And then if you add some reading suggestions, I'll jump into them as well. But physiognomy goes something like this: the physical attributes of an individual's body manifest as representations of their internal character. If a person, you almost find something like this in the book of Proverbs, if you've read the Old Testament or parts of the Old Testament, where the book of Proverbs says things like, such and such is like vinegar on the teeth, or rots the bones, or is like or you know, these kind of terms, is like a lame foot, or causes this. And you get almost this idea of like, if someone acts immorally in this fashion, it manifests in their person in this way. The Greeks had an idea, this is that we were talking about physiognomy, is that like, you know, a man of good character because he is a good looking man. He's strong, he's capable, or something like that. Whereas people who are typically of ill character represent that in their physical characteristics. They're dirty, they're sleazy, they look out of the sides of their eyes. This is one of the reasons why Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is both loved and hated. It's both admired and criticized, is that her characters definitely follow this rule of physiognomy. The good characters are always upright and straight and angled, whereas the bad characters are always soft and pudgy and fleshy and kind of disdainful in that sense. And if you go back to the example on Twitter, you find almost a one-to-one correlation that a person willing to advocate for something like democide very oftentimes looks weak. Is there any way other to say it? They look weak. And Twitter is not exactly a good grounds for finding morality, as we've said, but this is an example that I found continuously reminding of this principle. And that goes something like this. Those who are capable of violence are much more likely to temper their advocacy for violence. In fact, those who are capable and aware of their capability of violence, they have the ability to choose, to scale, to decide how to act appropriate in that scenario. Or maybe it goes something like this. Those who have seen violence are much less likely to advocate it. And of those who have seen violence, many of those people have learned from it. And it's not universal. It's certainly, if we observe the world, we definitely see people who experience violence and then engage in vengeance. Sometimes that vengeance extends well beyond the culprits to try to wreak havoc on entire nationalities, skin types, colors, whatever, religions of that sort. And what you see here is you see a constant starting to become apparent. And that is, generally speaking, we could also go back to like a Nicholas Nassim Taleb reference of a heuristic. It can be a useful heuristic to understand or to see that those who are capable of violence are less likely to advocate for it. Or more importantly, if you look at the history of the 1900s, some of the greatest acts of mass destruction of human life were done by people who believed themselves to be the victims. And if you read their language, they believed themselves to be the victims because they believed that they were not capable of doing the horrible things that were supposedly what they were doing. Or I'm sorry, they sort of believed that they were not capable of being the oppressors. They were the oppressed. And because of being the oppressed, they were then justified in fighting against their oppressors. And then instead of just justified against fighting against them, they decided to just kill off entire millions of people. And then you get into kind of a rough situation. So cheers to that horrible time. But what you have is you have this heuristic that starts to appear in our world. And it goes something like this. We've addressed it a couple times, and it's one of those difficult subjects that some days you can kind of see it well, and sometimes it's foggy, like through a mirror that is misted up because of the shower. Again, the internet will always make everything sexual, so might as well go down that way. But you see this kind of consistency arise, is that people who are trained, who have decided to train of their own volition and have learned how to become capable of violence, are less likely to advocate for it. Or maybe they recognize they are gaining more consciousness of their moral imperatives not to engage in certain forms of provocation or violence or so long and so forth. And this comes out also in different ways. Why is it that when we think about training, we also want to think about training in use of force and whether it's justified or unjustified? And why do we want to think about de-escalation versus escalation? Why do we want to think about, when we're training, that we want to be more capable than just one scenario, because we want to be able to approach and treat the multiplicity of scenarios that we may face, and because we can't just fix everything with the barrel of a gun. And that is because I believe there is something to be said that with a few exceptions, those who become capable become more aware of, at least in a certain sense, their moral imperative on how to use that capability. And that moral imperative is there. If it is simply an imperative that you shall not infringe on other people's rights, how can you really understand what that's like if you think that you could never do it from the start? And so advocate for your government to do it for you. This is how we get this outcome. The people who do not train are the kinds of people that are more likely to advocate for something like democide. Democide, by definition, is the advocation and use of government to kill off its population or portions of its population. It's much more specific than something like genocide, because that can be done by another people. It can be done by just the population. It can be done by the government. It can be done by multiple things. But democide specifically refers to advocating for the government or the use of government to eradicate certain peoples. It can be both broad and narrow in that description, but democide is the indicative element of the 21st century. Because if we were going to look at the fascists or the National Socialists or whatever you want to call it now, it was sort of an advocation and justification for the government to commit its atrocities. And the same thing goes for the Stalinist and Leninist revolutions. And another one would be for like Mao's glorious environment, but that was it was also the breeding of insurgency as well. So so what we see here, and this is what I'm going to say as the moral imperative of why you should train. By training, by being capable, by learning to become capable of things, you learn you learn the appropriateness of their application. Especially in this world, because I mean, if you don't learn, you'll probably end up prison or dead very quickly. Violence is one of those very specific things where if you, as they say, you F around, you find out. And we don't want, and so while there are some certainly unjustified examples of how that is treated in the 21st century, what we recognize is that when we look at other men as men, when we say things like, I don't want people infringing on my rights, I'm going to understand that these are the rights that I don't infringe on. And then I can see that those people have them as well because we're all people. And then we can move on from there. This is one of the moral advantages somebody gains by becoming dangerous, is that by becoming dangerous, they understand that they need to throttle it. They need to control it. Going back to the Jordan Peterson quote, they need to be able to be dangerous and then have it in their control. And we want to focus on this as more than just a nice, pretty speech. We want to focus on this as a moral imperative of why you should train. A weak person, if we were to somehow divide people into some sort of binary category between the weak and the strong, a weak person, a person who considers themselves weak, even, or a person who has intentionally made themselves weak, believes that they are not capable, generally speaking, believes that they're not capable of doing the violence. Something like this. And because a person believes that they're not capable of doing it, they are much more willing to stray into that field of advocating for, even participating in, because they want to feel strong. Whereas somebody who is capable of violence is going to be on the inverse. They understand it, and they understand that they are capable, and they should understand that they are morally required to have control over that. And if you make yourself weak or you refuse to train, then how can you really say that you are fulfilling that moral imperative to be in control of your capabilities? If you just simply let it go by the whims of your day, then how can you say that you are following in line with the imperative that you should be capable of, or you should be understanding and capable of controlling your capacity? If we see this, and if you just want to use this as a microcosm of the gun culture conversation, let's just say you're in a scenario where somebody, or you're in a scenario where you enter into a scenario, you enter into a situation where there is a threat, but that threat doesn't justify using a firearm. And we're not talking about legal, we're talking about moral here. It doesn't morally justify using a firearm because you know that once you open that door, once you skin that smoke wagon, though it doesn't just, end gently. I mean, with the exception of Hollywood and some other scenarios. But the point being said is if the only thing that you know how to do is draw and shoot, then how are you going to be able to evaluate the potentiality of violence that's around you? Because all you can see is one potential. You only know one thing. If you don't know how to maneuver, if you don't know how to clear a room, if you don't know how to CQB, if you don't know how to survey an area, if you don't know how to at least have some modicum of understanding with hand to hand, I'm not saying go out and everyone has to do collie, but if you are a one trick pony when it comes to skill sets that are germane to gun culture, then aren't you going to be a one trick pony when it comes to perceiving those types of threats? And this would be something even more broadly, perhaps a liability. Maybe your team doesn't have any value. Maybe you are a liability to your team because they cannot trust you to act correctly in a high risk but low violence environment. Maybe they cannot trust you to act appropriately to the threat that's presented. And now you're putting your team at risk as well as yourself, and so on and so forth. And so this is part of what that imperative comes into, is that on the one hand, we understand, or on the one hand, I will make the argument that people who believe that they are incapable of violence, who believe that they are the oppressed, the downtrodden, or whatever, are much more willing to advocate for that type of violence that is indicative of the 1900s, and that is democide and massive killing. And those who are whereas those who are at least aware of their capabilities are able to gauge and throttle their use of force in an appropriate scenario to the situation at hand. They are able to make moral evaluations more effectively. In fact, they might even be the only ones able to make moral evaluations at all in this regards. How can you expect a person who doesn't understand what a gun does to make moral evaluations of how it should be used? Sure, they have the indignancy of some sort of moral imperative that is usually a virtue signal, but there's usually tied to it a massive lack of knowledge, which is exhausting and something that we have to continue engaging with. But rather, we can look out and say, oh, that's ugly, I don't want to be that. What we should be able to do is look inside and say, hey, if I really want to make sure that I am acting correctly, I should learn how to become capable and be in control of that capability. I should train so that I can make decisions wisely in a complicated and semi-permissive environment, if you want to quote someone like Travis Haley. What's the family relationship of that whole tribe now? It's Travis Haley and Garantham and Admin and who else now? Who else? I don't know. It's fun. But no, that is the moral imperative that is embedded into this argument, is that you should learn, you should train so that you are capable and you are aware of your capability so that you may scale that capability to the appropriate scenario that you exist in. And that is what I think is a more distinct version of a moral imperative that does not leave you in a scenario where you have to base the morality of being capable on the potentiality of danger. In fact, you might want to make the argument that a person who does not know their capability is going to have a very difficult time, or maybe might even be so far as incapable of discerning what dangers they may or may not be in. But remember, the goal in most of this is to make ourselves better, to look inside and make sure that we have the intellectual tools in our own world, in our own mind, in our own heart, to approach the world in a morality first position. It is more important to be moral than it is to be legal. We know that there's a difference between the two. And since we understand that, it is a sort of imperative, a divine imperative, if you want to get even that aggressive, that we ought learn what we are capable of, train that capability so that we may deploy it in times where it is morally appropriate and contain it in times when it is not. I hope that this has added something to your toolbox, because in many ways we face a intellectual war against ourselves, and I don't want to fall too quickly into that use of language to rile people up. But one thing that the one thing that has become the foundation, the goal, the objective of this show is to focus on the things, the ideas, the philosophy, the study of concepts that will give you intellectual tools to address the threats that we face. We have plenty of firearms, and we have plenty of plate carriers and night vision. We have all this gear around us. And while we recognize that buying gear does not make us better, training will improve. And on top of that hierarchy, or one part in that hierarchy, something to add to it, something that is necessary for all of us, is to consider how we think about it. Because if I can defeat you in your mind before you even raise your weapon, then my job has been made easiest, and conquering this world will be swift and painful for those who are conquered. That being the case, this has been the 91st episode of the Redacted Culture Cast. If you are still listening, if you have comments, please leave them below on the YouTube. If you are on our other platforms, the podcasting platforms, we really appreciate it if you leave a review, share it with your friends. This is our goal here, is to continue edifying and adding value to the gun culture conversation in this country. If you want to talk about stuff and things, you can always do that elsewhere. But this is about ideas, the philosophy of violence, and how we understand what we think to be right and true and good. If you want to join in the conversation, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. We have conversations there regularly, including over books and over discussions of ideas. I think the word presuppositionalism has been coming up lately, so that's going to be a fun one. And that is also where we can have the best interaction between each other. So if not, we'll talk to you soon. We'll see you tomorrow. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast, episode 91, Why You Should Become Dangerous.